which potentially lets dangerous criminals off on something lighter than they should have gotten. So yeah, I see many issues with that, and I think it's definitely a good area for one to focus their activism.
While we're talking about the court system today, since most of these are good young people, good kids, they're never going to be on the wrong desk in a courtroom, but many of you will be called up as jurors early in your adult lives. So as long as you're 18, you can serve on a jury. And there's a process here.
Excuse me, interruption, Mr. Prue, please call the main office.
Here in New Hampshire called jury nullification that recently became codified in law, and it's a beautiful way for you all to be involved in having a very positive outcome. Ian can explain a little bit better how it works at the technical level, but keep in mind, you or your parents or your older siblings or cousins, they get called to be jurors, and now you'll have some information to share with them on something called jury nullification. What is that, Ian?
Well, we did not bring, unfortunately, the jury nullification flyers with us, but you can go to nhjury.com and you can learn more about this. But basically, something that they don't tell you when you become a juror is that you have the right to nullify a verdict. So normally when you're in a trial, the judge will give you what they call jury instructions, and the judge will say something like, you have to judge this case based on the facts in the case and the application of the law itself. And that's only half of the truth. The other half of the truth that they won't tell you is that you have the right to judge the law itself. Meaning that if you are in a trial, let's say it's for the underage drinking, like a college student. She's 20, they caught her with a beer while she's walking to her friend's house. Happens all the time in Keene. Let's say she goes to trial, you get called onto the jury, and you think that that's just a dumb law. That's just a law that just shouldn't be on the books because she didn't create a victim. Who was the victim? Well, you should be able to do those things for yourself, right? So she didn't hurt anybody else. And so if you agree with me that that's a bad law, or maybe you think the war on drugs is insane and it's hurting your friends and your family members, either way, let's say they caught her red-handed. She had that beer in her hands, so like all the facts in the case are crystal clear. Like she broke that law. There's no doubt about it. But if you think the law is bad, then you can vote not guilty. As a juror, you can use your conscience and vote not guilty. And that's what jury nullification is. You are nullifying bad laws. They won't tell you about this. New Hampshire's the only state, as Mark mentioned, it was a fairly recent piece of legislation here in New Hampshire. New Hampshire's the only state where you can talk about jury nullification in a courtroom. If I was standing in that courtroom as a defendant, I would be able to tell you about jury nullification. But whether or not the attorney or the defendant tells you about jury nullification, you have the right to nullify. You have the right to use your conscience in any court case and judge. You can say not guilty if you think the law itself is bad. You can ignore what the judge tells you. He will try to intimidate you into doing what he says. I mean, he's wearing a robe and he's sitting up higher than you are. So, there's this religious aspect. Want to say something?
I wanted to add to that, yes. Jury nullification is not a new idea. It's a very old idea, something that our founding fathers spoke about. And it was used in the Peter Zenger case back in 1735, I believe. Mr. Cora would probably remember before I would. Because he was printing things against the government, and the government had him arrested, and it was England at the time. It wasn't even the United States, but it happened on our soil. Also, another case was the bad laws against the fugitive slave law, whereas if a slave escaped to New York or New Hampshire, we had to send them back to their state. So those two cases, jury nullification was used a lot. So it's not even an old idea. It's not a new idea. It's an old idea that is, personally, I think it's a good idea because it puts the onus on the people to nullify bad laws that a small group of people have passed.
Question?
Garrett, you and Ian have a very strong, word against what you believe about the war on drugs. Well, how do you feel about the Second Amendment and how they're trying to take away gun violence and everything?
I see the biggest threat to the Second Amendment being from the federal government and under the guise of we're liberalizing drug laws across the country, therefore nobody's allowed to have guns anymore. Because right now the way the federal laws are written, guns are, if they're legal to the extent that they're legal, that's okay. But if somebody has some cannabis with somewhere near their gun, or even in the same house, that I believe is a federal issue, and you can have your guns stripped from you for being associated with drug use. Right now, there's no laws about guns and alcohol, other than you're not supposed to be carrying a firearm when you're drunk and things like that, of course. So that's the one threat I do see to the Second Amendment, is under the guise of cannabis laws are liberalizing, other drug laws may liberalize, so people can't have guns because they're allowed to have drugs. But other than that, if you live in a state where they're cracking down on it, of course, that's an issue. I don't see the Second Amendment or the federal Constitution or the federal government as capable of protecting anything. I think individuals need to focus more on state and local level. In New Hampshire, we have Article 2A in the New Hampshire Constitution, which is much stronger in its protection of the individual right to bear arms than the federal Constitution is. So to that extent, I'd say we're safe here, but that doesn't necessarily bode well for other parts of the country or the world.
I was going to say, remember, the government hates competition. The government is a monopoly in everything they do, and all monopolies don't like competition. So you'll find government at the state level and the federal level always growing, always engaging in mission creep, trying to add more power, more scope, more cost to what it's doing. And I think it's smart to be a bit anti-authoritarian once in a while and push back. We need to do more of that.
I'm glad you asked that question. I think that as somebody who believes in liberty and your right to live your life how you want, as long as you don't harm anyone else, I think that means you also have the right to protect yourself. And whatever that means, whether it's guns, because the Second Amendment talks about bearing arms, so that could be more than guns. It could mean nunchucks or pepper spray or whatever it is you think is samurai sword, whatever it is you feel helps you feel safe. I think that you should be free to do that, so long as you aren't threatening people with the weapon, as long as it's only there for your own personal defense or the defense of your family or your loved ones. I fully support your right. I support your right to possess anything that you want. It's your body, it's your life, it's you. You should be free to do as you choose. Again, as long as there's no victim. And I think that the gun issue is interesting because there are a lot of parallels between, sort of the war on drugs and the war on defense, the war on personal freedom to defend oneself. And I think that the interest groups are very distinct in those areas. Usually there's not a whole lot of crossover between the gun guys and the drug war people. But there really should be. They really should support each other. They should realize that all of these things we're talking about here is about your personal freedom. And one thing that's really important is that if you're not willing to stand up for the freedoms of someone else, maybe, as a gun guy, you might not really feel like you can identify with somebody who wants to end the war on drugs. But if you can see them as being a group of people who's being persecuted, and if the people that want to end the war on drugs can see the gun owners as another group that's being persecuted, and if everybody can stand up for the rights of everybody else, then we'll have more freedom. But I think it was Pastor Martin Niemöller who in the World War II times is famous, and I'm going to paraphrase his famous poem now. He said, first they came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't stand up. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't stand up. And eventually they came for me, but there was no one else left to stand up at that point. So I think it's very important to identify that even though there may be people who do things you don't agree with, who like things that you don't like, who live in a different way than you would choose to live, that they should all be stood up for if their rights are being threatened. Do y'all have any other questions so far? Anybody got? You've already done one, so I want to make sure we get a chance. We can come back to you, but I just want to make sure everybody else gets a chance to ask a question if you have one. Yes, sir. Go ahead and say your name.
Trevor Parsons. Do you think people should be taught to be self-governed rather than governed by the government?
Great question. Ideally, we'd like your parents, or each person's parents, to teach them about self-governance, right? Everybody grows for the first 18 years of your life being governed by your parents, as it should be, but outside of that, we'd like to see that sort of education come from the home. We think that has the most impact. And yes, beyond that, definitely it'd be nice to have public schools and all type of secondary schools teach you about self-governance. It's just not going to happen, right?
They're run by the state.
What?
They're run by the state.
They're run by the state, yeah. And they have compulsory attendance at these state-run schools, so I don't see that happening. But we could wish for it.
You know, you mentioned the compulsory attendance. There's a lady in Keene who came across the ideas of liberty and had such an epiphany, she just decided that she was going to pull all of her kids out of the government schools and you know, bring them home and unschool them. So you might have heard of homeschooling. There's also something called unschooling, which is like it seems like a really radical idea in schooling. Unschooling is where you aren't in a place like this. You would basically stay home and you could kind of do whatever you wanted to. You would direct your own learning. You would decide what you thought was the most interesting thing to learn. You would be the person who would be in charge of your curriculum and your education. You could seek out whatever experts and seek out whatever information that you wanted to. Anyway, she brought her kids out of the government school because she wanted them to make, you know, to have their own control over their education. And the state came after her for it. They came after her with negligence charges. And she, of course, didn't take the plea deal, thank goodness. And guess what? They dropped the charges before trial. So she's okay. They didn't stop her from doing it. But what they did try to do was intimidate her into bringing her kids back into the government schools by charging her with negligence. So I don't think that really answered your question. What was the question again?
Where do they learn self-governance?
Right, so learning self-governance, I mean, we all govern ourselves, obviously. I mean, you got here today on your own volition. You could have gone somewhere else had you wanted to. I think that personal responsibility is a really important thing. And the more that we can imbue young people with the sense of personal responsibility for their lives, that's really important. To look to the state for any kind of solution is a mistake. The state fails at almost everything that it tries to do. And even if it does accomplish something, even if it does, manage to build a school or build a road or something like that, it still hasn't done it in an affordable manner. It hasn't done it in an efficient manner. And that's because the state can just count on money coming in year after year because your parents are all being threatened if they're homeowners. If they don't pay the property tax bill that comes in, men with guns will show up to their home 3 or 4 years later after they've gotten a bunch of threatening letters from the state, and they will come and they will forcibly remove you from your home. And then you'll be homeless. And everybody knows that. Everybody who's a property taxpayer knows ultimately that there's a threat of violence behind what they're doing. And I think that anytime you have to threaten somebody with violence, it's proof you've got a bad idea, that your system is broken and you're doing it the wrong way. If you've got a good idea, people come on board. You've got something that people appreciate. You want to get to where you want to go. People like roads. Roads are a good idea. It wouldn't be hard to fund roads or schools or whatever without the threat of violence. But the state has always had violence behind it. And I think that's one of the key points that I think all three of us would like to see change.
I think to a large extent, self-governance is discouraged or disincentivized by the system we all grow up through, whether it's through the schools, through the legal system. It isn't like there's a point at which one is treated as a free adult. There's 16 you can drive, 17 you can go to R-rated movies, 18 you get a few more privileges, 21 you can drink, 25 you can rent a car. It doesn't seem like there's a clear point at which people's decisions are respected. There's just an arbitrary amount of time up to which you'll be treated as a criminal for possessing alcohol, and then magically at midnight one day, it's totally okay and funds aren't invested in attacking you. So maybe if things were more streamlined, it would be easier for people to understand self-governance, but I think information is going to help with that.
Here we go.
What did you mean by when you said you defeated a 20-year-old veteran or something like that? What did you mean by that?
Oh, that was probably myself. There was a 20-year incumbent in the State House who had that seat for a very long time. And myself and a few other people who ran against her in the primary, we got more votes than she did, and she was outed for that. We didn't take her seat. It was filled by one of our, somebody running against us, but we did unseat her.
We actually thought you meant like a real veteran.
Oh, like military veteran?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for the question.
My name's Nate, and you said non-violence, like you don't support that. How else would you get people to do what you want without that? I mean, truly, like you can't really take many more things away from people to get them to do what you want.
Well, I guess that's the society is structured on that at the moment. I mean, I don't know when exactly the state came into being that there was an organization that would claim to fill social functions in the name of everyone. But the people alive today, if we consider the Constitution the start of this country, there's a great essay called The Constitution of No Authority by someone named Lysander Spooner. It was written in 1860. And it goes down to the idea of social contract being an agreement between people. And the Constitution that we have today was, at best, an agreement between the people alive at the time of its formation. So right now, it isn't like anyone alive today said, yes, I want to be a part of this system. But everybody still acts as though the system is very real and they pay their taxes and everything else. So to me, I think I'd like to move beyond a system that's based on coercion and based on the threat of if you don't pay, you're going to jail, and instead be voluntary, and if you don't pay, we just won't provide you the service. So to me, I think for many people to realize that the violence inherent in the system, I think many people just block it out, kind of ignore it. But yeah, like Ian said, anybody who pays their property taxes has to know I'm doing this under a certain coercive structure.
Mark, what do you think about that question?
There are a number of approaches, and we look at voluntary actions among people as the best way to conduct your daily life. And in fact, most people out there, that's how they do their lives. In the morning, you guys get up, take a shower, come to school, you either take the bus or walk, or your parents give you a ride. Your parents go to work, they work, they're productive to earn a paycheck. All this is done voluntarily. Nobody has a knife at their back to do it. They're doing it because